can you take away from Ford and the $2 cookie? Plenty. Whether you've seen these headlines or haven't heard of this is a situation that everyone can learn from at work, especially if you're in HR or a manager. I've been an employment lawyer and in HR for years before I started Manager Method, and it can be helpful to look at specific situations, whether cases or news articles, to see what happens at work and lessons that you can take away, and mistakes sometimes that can be really human to make. Now, imagine this. You're Kurt Crom, an electrician at the Kentucky Ford truck plant, and you've worked there for over a decade, and you get called into the labor office and are told you're being fired for stealing a cookie worth $1.95, and even told by your union representative to apologize. Now, this is what we've heard from Kurt Crom in the public, because he'd said that they were told that the week prior on an overnight shift, he had stolen a cookie. Now, Kurt's version of this is, yeah, I took the cookie, but I paid for it, because he was having a blood sugar episode and needed to get the cookie overnight. And he said that these machines within the vending machine or the cafeteria at the Ford truck plant, they'd been known to have issues. So he tried to swipe his card, had gotten an error, and the second time swiped it and it didn't have the same error. So he took the cookie. But then was told a week later, hey, you were fired because you didn't pay for this. Well, he went back and looked at his bank statements and even ended up getting notarized to show, hey, I actually paid for that cookie. Well, what's happened since is that Ford has allegedly come back and offered to reinstate him, given him his job back, and offered him $33,000 in back pay because they'd let him go, but all over a $1.95 cookie. Now, this is a situation that gets headlines. It's been in places like the New York Post and all over social media because it sounds absolutely ridiculous. You fire someone for a cookie like this, but it's a real situation of things that can happen at work. And it's really important, especially if you're in HR or a manager, to take these lessons away. Because what would most of us say looking at this? Okay, well, first of all, who has time to be looking through and seeing if people are stealing a cookie worth less than $2? Okay, well, for whatever reason, with the error mark machines within the facility, they had thought that people were stealing things. And so whatever flagged these, this is brought to the attention. But like a lot of us, we would want the situation, if we were in Kurt Crom's shoes or any other employee's shoes, that if someone suspected us of something, to at least have the opportunity to give an answer. Or in this case, to look back and say, okay, well, I didn't take it intentionally. Hopefully you can see me multiple times trying to swipe through if you have video footage. But also, let me go show you my bank statement that shows that I actually paid for this. And that's a conversation that people want to have. And of course, someone's probably going to get frustrated anyway if they were accused of taking a cookie less than $2 and think, okay, this is really what we're spending our time on, but let me show you I didn't. But it's a much better conversation to have and a much cheaper one than offering over $30,000 in back pay, to have it after the fact and have it be a headline, because now this employee has gotten a lawyer as well to figure out his next steps. Now again, while this is a headline that you may think, I would never do something like that, things like this do happen all the time at work. Whether it's you're in HR and there's a senior leader that tells you something happened and says, we're making a change because of this. Well, then maybe that change means someone's going to lose their job. And then after the fact, they have a lawyer and start presenting their side of the story. And you think to yourself, well, I wish we could have had this conversation before the decision was made to let them go. And it's not just HR, it's managers as well. You may hear something from a customer that says, well, this is what happened. And you may have the perspective of, okay, well, the customer's always right. How can you do this? And you let go an employee or you discipline them. And they say, well, that's not what happened at all. Now, you may have things at work that are, whether it's he said, she said, or they said, of whoever's saying things back and forth, of that there are times that people may dispute something that actually happened, but giving someone an opportunity to hear their side of the story is a step that does get skipped. Whether it's a situation like this and someone immediately loses their job, or you come into a conversation assuming that things happened. And so how can you address this as a manager or as HR? I talk a lot about the pause, consider, act framework. I talk about this in my book, The Manager Method, and in the training and the resources that we do. But it's a simple step to first have that pause. Because here, we don't know, and I guess it's possible if there's actually a lawsuit filed, we'll get more information on it, on how Ford figured out, or with Aramark, its vendor of this cookie and the cookie checkout, of how this happened, that they figured out that they thought he had taken the cookie. But even if we don't know that, what we know is that they had confronted him and made it as an accusation of, you're going to lose your job because of stealing this. And so first to pause, to think, okay, what's information we know and what we don't know? Even if you have video footage. Again, here it's shown that he was trying to swipe his credit card if they could have shown that. But first is really to pause, to consider before you take the action, because it's not to skip the first two steps and to just act. But in the consider phase, one thing I talk about a lot is to think about if you're on the other side of that. Now, plenty of people may say, well, okay, well, I wouldn't steal a cookie. I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't do that. But to consider, if you were accused of something, especially if you believe that you're entirely right, but what if on the other side and you weren't right? This is the time before you do anything that you want to have that information before you do something that you have to walk back later. And so to consider, how would I feel if I were the person on the other side of this? Again, most of us would feel, okay, first you're going to, of all priorities, you're going to come after me for a $2 cookie. Well, someone's stealing it. Okay, that's different. But here in this situation, to have that conversation and ask someone, okay, we've had this, reward of things stolen. We didn't get a swipe from you, but we're trying to figure this out. Did you pay for this cookie or not? To have that conversation and to think about having that in a more human way can help get rid of all of the miscommunication after the fact or the assumptions that you have to walk back. And so in the consider phase, how can I approach this as a conversation? And again, sometimes someone's actually going to have done something wrong and the act phase will have to deal with that and figure out what the consequences are. But when you have that and in a fair way, to talk objectively about what you've seen, hey, we saw this, rather than make an accusation and say, you did this. Again, that can help that person give their perspective, even if at the end of the day, you conclude, or everything suggests that what you thought happened actually did. But the key of any process, whether it's a decision about someone's employment or even just a day-to-day conversation, is to make sure that someone at least feels like they were treated fairly. Because in this here, this employee is seeking out a lawyer to potentially figure out next steps, so it may be a judge or a jury that weighs in on their opinion. But people, when third parties, especially whether it's jurors or the court of social media, readers are looking at things, they don't like where it seems like people jump to conclusions in a negative way about somebody else. And they tend to judge things like employers, HR managers, pretty harshly when you do. And so in this situation, one takeaway is really that, is to think about pause, consider, act. And before you make a conclusion or a decision, is to make sure as much as possible you're getting information and the perspective from the other person before you act and make that decision. Because this is one that I can pretty much guarantee Ford Motor Company wishes they'd done, but this is something that people can jump to and things that can have happen and have happened more than just this situation. But if you take the opportunity to do this, you may end up with information you weren't expecting, but at the very least, you can make sure that every decision you make and every conversation you have feels and really is fair.